again, we're back for the second book in the Andromeda duology, isn't it? That's what the kids call them nowadays, isn't it? Duologies.
Yeah.
The Andromeda Breakthrough. That both me and Gavin have read and watched the TV series. Well, I have. I don't know whether he has, which was flying around on YouTube at the moment anyway.
I did. I probably didn't sit down and watch everything of it.
No, I was a bit like that. I was in the
background whilst I was rearranging my bookshelves. So I think I went through the entire series pretty much in not a sitting, but a standing.
Yeah. I also heard the audiobook of it as well.
Oh, right. Blimey. Yeah. Okay. You've gone above and beyond there.
But it was just that, we had it because we did. And I listened to it. But the audiobook is actually... just the way it's read is a bit weird.
Who read it?
I can't remember. It's a female reader, but she keeps putting on these weird accents that just sort of put me off a little bit. But it wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad read. But this is said literally follows directly on from the last book, basically, and it just opens up with There will be huge spoilers in this because that's the only way we can talk about it, by the way. So if you've not read it and you want to read it, go and read it. But it starts directly after basically military going up to Forness, which is where it all happened in the last episode, after the computer got blown up. And then we have the scientist Fleming getting captured and going out to find that Andromeda, who we thought was dead at the end of the last episode, but was actually on an island. And we followed down this weird little rabbit hole. And I must admit, for the first, probably until we got away from there, I was a bit bored with it. And I don't know whether it's their writing style or whatever.
I think it's probably... I think it's a narrative necessity of having to unpick all the things they've neatly wrapped up at the end of what they thought was going to be a standalone series. Because
I was a bit bored with it. And I don't think the prose in it helps because it's not the most engaging. It's quite straightforward. Because obviously it was written by John Elliott, who's writes scripts, so that's going to be normally more straightforward. And then you've obviously got Hoyle, who's the scientist, but then you've read more Hoyle than I have, and you said that his stuff by himself is actually very readable.
It can be. Certainly his later stuff. I think October the 1st is Too Late is probably the best book of his I've read. And possibly the first Andromeda book may be the weakest. I enjoyed this one more.
I did as well.
But like you, at the beginning, I was wondering, quite where this is going. And
it turns into a Cold War thriller halfway through is when it gets really interesting.
I mean, I would say that there's already sort of more action at the beginning, or at least activity, than almost the entirety of the first series. So you've got a fight in these caves, you've got a trip to this island, you've got the military turning up, you've got escape on a boat and traveling to yet another island, and there's still, like you say with the dialogue, there is the sit down scene between, oh, hello, I'm a new military person, I've just turned up, well, let me fill you in on exactly what's happened in the last season. And so that, again, these things are sort of by necessity, and I don't feel they need to be copied, transliterated quite so much into the novelization. But I should imagine it's quite a decent time saver for the writers as well. This book came like 2 years after the first book, so they must have known this might happen. So I think the first book came before the second season. So am I saying season? I should be saying series. This is British.
Yeah, series were British. So.
Yes. But
yes, because I think Souvenir for the first one, Souvenir Press heard about it, and then they asked them to specifically if they could have the rights to the book, and they thought, oh, we've got to turn this into a book, which is why I think the first book feels so scripty, when probably why the second one feels a little more like a novel.
Yeah. And I think you see more scene changes purely because the first series has been a success, and we are able to afford at least to pretend we are in different places.
Yeah, apparently they filmed in Cyprus, but none of the cast did. So they did some outside scenes in Cyprus, but everybody else was inside, so they didn't have to send them to Cyprus.
Well, yeah, I mean, you see that again with all the scenes of people when people are talking. Yeah, they're never out and about on location. They are still within, a very similar looking laboratory to the laboratory from the first one. But I mean, I suppose we better explain how they've got written themselves out of this
so
hole.
They go to end up on an island in the Western Isles where they meet this nice stereotypical CND activist who happens to have a gun. I don't know why, as you do, guns are 10 a penny in Britain. Oh, no, they're not. So, which was quite weird. And then you've got, what's her name? I can never remember these names. The problem, I've still, Dornay, the woman, she meets up with Fleming at an airport because Andromeda has got her hands burnt from the explosion and they're trying to heal them. And so she gives some of the enzyme that they created in the last book to heal her hands, but through her. And then she goes to this embassy for this made up country called Azeran, which is like a sort of paint by numbers Middle Eastern country of what you expect an Arab nation to be like, even though at the time. But it's quite interesting that they didn't pick a Eastern, considering Cold War was on. I'm quite amazed that they didn't pick some weird made up Russian state or something for this.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of read Azeran, and I'm sort of guessing Azerbaijan. Then you can have a little bit of Middle Eastern feel and a little bit of, sort of Soviet bloc influence as well.
I think it says it's between sort of Turkey. It's meant to be between Turkey and Iran.
Yeah,
sort of area. So
it's very woolly. I don't think they want to be pinned down to be a particular place.
But anyway, she goes to this embassy for this environmental job. They drug her, give her sodium pentothal, find out where Andromeda and Fleming are, and then they sent a bunch of the most inept soldiers there to try and kidnap them. And then, weirdly, the British Army end up turning up, and then they take them to a so-called safe house, and then they get kidnapped again by the Azeran people, and then taken to Azeran, which is basically being controlled by Intel, who's the big multinational corporation that was trying to control everything in the last series. And it's all set up just to get them to this place, Azeran, so they can tell the story there.
But it still takes a while for everyone to get there.
There's a
lot of stuff we have to go through first, which, I mean, I suppose you don't want to make it too quick. But at the same time, I mean, this gives, I think, a little bit of a chance for, I mean, Fred Hoyle, having read Ossian's Ride and this as well, he must have loved the spy genre and the espionage genre. He's called the main character Fleming, which maybe is a bit of a clue. But by this point, I should imagine 62, 63, I think we're about to start, if we haven't already started, with all of the James Bond films. So espionage stuff is pretty much on people's minds. It doesn't always work. It's pretty ropey spy work. They sort of go, I'm going to somewhere disguised as an Englishman using no pseudonym. I'm not armed, but I have good manners. And they seem, as a secret service, of singularly ill-equipped and ill-informed about whoever it is that they're dealing with. It's like, oh, Intel, yes, I've heard of them. They're a big company. It's like, well, yeah, they're also got enemy agents acting. And they don't seem to follow up the fact that you've had gunmen try to take Fleming and Andromeda.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, well, that happened. Oh, don't worry, we shot them. Oh, okay, so I'm sure that threat's all over now. You've still got Kaufman, so Lobot's back. He's got a bit more of a meaty part in this series. He's pretty terrible throughout, in terms of being inept.
But they're all pretty inept, really.
He ends up with his heart being in the right place, sort of, but not believed. Yeah, but they are. I mean, there's not a lot of character development from the first.
I still had problems while reading this, identifying one character from another. I had to write a list of characters down, so I had them, so I could just remember the names, because I still had problems. He was writing like Dorney. He still wrote that like he was writing Fleming, almost. The characters, they weren't sort of differentiated in their personalities and that. And then you get like Kaufman was slightly different, but they all seems to blur at some point.
Yeah,
I don't think it was differentiated enough. And I think, but from what I've seen of it was more obvious when watching the TV series, because obviously you could see them physically.
Yeah, I mean that makes it better. And it helped actually piece together stuff from the last series. So I couldn't even remember Osborn from the first book. Osborn's got a much bigger part here. And he actually seems to be a little more competent than the rest of the British establishment. Yeah. But he is now under suspicion because he obviously has allowed the first computer, or aided the first computer's destruction. So he is, he's under a cloud. He's now going to be under investigation. And then we have a little bit of spycraft where he ends up out in, is it Vienna?
Yeah, I think Vienna.
Going to some UN conference on the weather, which plays a bigger part as the book goes on. This is like the first hint of this being a subject, and meets a former colleague of Fleming, who has, unbeknownst to anybody, been kidnapped by Intel and held in Azaran for the past few years. So he's escaped and barely gets a word out of his mouth before he's killed. But it brings in this scientist father, who is also a scientist and a climatologist, who is on this UN symposium. But Osborn is immediately recalled back to London and is basically arrested. At the same time, he ends up in the same place that Fleming and Andromeda are. But Osborn has a much bigger role in this book than he did in the first one, and I actually did recognize him here. I think with Fleming and Dorney, they are ciphers for two different ways of looking at science, and there's not a lot of character actually.
They weren't particularly likable, either of them.
No, Fleming is still an arse.
Yeah,
I thought he was in the first one. He seems unnecessarily cruel to Andromeda and dismissive of everybody else, and he just seems to be angry at everything all the time. Dorney she's a little better. She's just very driven. There is nothing there other than what she wants to do, but what she wants to do is actually more altruistic, perhaps, than a number of the other scientists.
I found it interesting you didn't get Judy Adamson back. She was such a big thing of the first.
She was, she's.
And there was no explanation. She just wasn't there.
I mean, I suppose there would be very little for her to do.
Yeah.
But the character's just gone, and they're not mentioned
again.
No, not at all. And obviously, we've also had in the TV program, Julie Christie has also gone and has been replaced.
Yes.
So that's more scheduling conflicts than anything else. But so that actress who played Adamson, doesn't get a mention. It's like she died in the first one, which is considering, yeah, she did have quite a big part, but do you need her for this?
Probably not, because they wanted to sort of imply a love interest in the end between Fleming and Andromeda, though it was a bit of a weird way they did it.
Yes, and I mean that sort of continues as well.
It starts off that it's almost like she's a child, which is where it gets a bit, yeah.
Yes, I mean I suppose you have less of a problem watching it as a television because you're thinking, oh right, she's obviously not a child.
Yes.
Than you do reading it, where
the way she speaks is very childlike. Yeah.
And increasingly so in this one. I mean, her character actually disintegrates throughout the first half, at least, of this book, where, I mean, what we see here is like she relies symbiotically on the machine for her purpose for being, and without that, she seems pretty vacant intellectually, and she's cast adrift in that respect, because the thing that is telling her how to act has been destroyed.
Yeah,
and then you mirrored by her physical disintegration throughout this book.
Because conveniently, in Azran they've managed to rebuild the computer because they've got the plans off of the guy that was spying in the last book. So they've rebuilt the computer, but it's not connected, so that when they get there, Andromeda can almost link with it again.
At least that was pretty believable.
It sort of made a purpose for the guy spying originally. So
yeah, this is it's handy. I mean, it is, to be honest, it's something that didn't really feel it went anywhere in the first book. So seeing that come back as being the reason to be able to have a second series and a second book is, I don't know if that's forethought on the part of Hoyle and Elliot. I think possibly, because I mean it was pretty unsatisfying how that ended. Because you have Dennis is quite a big character in the last one, and he's just killed off, and it's just like, well, what was the good of that? Now we find out that there actually was a reason behind it, but had there been no recommissioning of Andromeda, then that would be quite a weird thing to have been left hanging. But so we are able to, we now have scenes at an airport, scenes at Vienna, scenes at Vienna airport, scenes in Pimlico, I think, and then in Azaran. So there's a lot more movement and dynamism in the locales than there was in the first book, even within the first few chapters. But once you're in those locales, you are still basically people in rooms talking. And I think this is the same problem we had with the first book, is, well, this is the limitation of how they were filming the show. You still got those technical limitations. We're not filming out on location. Everything has to be done on a set. So any time there is dialogue, it is people just in not very dynamic office environment.
Yeah, and the problem is I think that the speech and that isn't particularly well written, so it's not going to grab you. To do men in rooms and that, you've got to be able to vocalize that really well to keep it interesting as a reader. That's one thing Asimov was always very good of, because he did lots of, especially like the Foundation, there's lots of people in dark rooms smoking cigars reading, and because of what he wrote and how he wrote it, it makes it interesting. Whereas this was a bit more, would blur into one. There was interesting stuff there, but I think it got a bit confused at points.
Yeah, you don't have the thrust that you had in the first one either. Whereas we've got this unknown plan. We're building this machine. We don't know what it does. And this time around, it's like, oh, you built another machine. Well, we know what this machine does. Why are you building it? And unfortunately, it's just, oh yeah, because we think it's going to make us a lot of money.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's
in
interesting.
Some ways, they were quite ahead of the time, thinking on multinational corporations trying to control everything, trying to make money off of anything, and considering sort of the political environment with Elon Musk doing nonsense and stuff, trying to influence all the political stuff. in some ways, it was quite ahead of its time in that way.
Yes, I mean, I'm trying to think whether I'm sure sort of big defense companies were having that kind of impact at that time, but it wasn't spoken
now.
Well, I mean, it's still not spoken about now, except for the fact that the damn man won't shut up. It's funny that it's called Intel. I think we sort of mentioned that last time.
Yeah, it is.
And I think, I mean, it seems to be like the first time sort of a multinational corporation is the bad guy in a book that I've read. I'm trying to think of something I've read earlier.
I've not read anything like that.
Crime syndicates, maybe, but those are syndicates that are geared towards crime. Intel has a legitimate front. It has legitimate business purposes. It is just be acting underhanded in certain ways. But their corporate structure, as depicted by Hoyle and Elliott, is
terrible.
Is lacking. It's like, well, you've got one person in charge of Azeran, which is this country they nearly have taken over. There is this board of directors who you don't see or hear. They're just almost mythical. But the actual for a company that's taken over a country, there doesn't seem to be many staff. You've got like 3 or 4 lab guys, and this woman, what's her name? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, but she was a bit of a weird character. She was like someone kidnapped and controlling, and
yes. So she starts off as, I mean, we first see her in London. She's the one who administers the truth drug to Dorne. Yeah. We next see her in Azeran, where she seems to be like the executive officer in charge of operations for an entire country, but the only executive that they seem to have there. And she's also like a spy master, and she is playing Salim, or she is using Salim to topple the president of Azeran. So Azeran is in the process of shaking off its colonial ties. So it's getting rid of its oil contracts. But as well, they're only able to, in this book, unshackle themselves from colonialism by throwing in their lot with Intel and basically putting all their eggs from one basket into another basket. She's not entirely convincing as a character. She's trying. They're using her to be too many things at the same time. You can't be in charge of the operations and be involved in espionage and be a femme fatale. They've got her doing too much. And then when she later becomes aware of what the machine is actually intending, and her entire character changes yet again, and she almost becomes like a second Andromeda.
Yeah.
But without Andromeda's technical capabilities. She just seems to be, she's very easily convinced, now this is what we have to do, and to hell with the world by this point, because she can't see what's happening almost outside of her window.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about the weather?
Yes, we can talk about the whole thing, because obviously the plot develops to the fact that then the weather starts changing, and this all comes back to a bacteria or something that ended up in the sea. And this is the bit that got to me, is because, and obviously it's changing the planet, and the nitrogen has been leached out of the air. So basically it's apocalyptic sort of events. But they do an investigation about it, and they find out that it was because Dorne basically was dealing with this stuff, and she washed a beaker out from having some bacteria in a normal sink and put it down the drain, which is some of the worst scientific practice ever, because you never do stuff like that. stuff like that is always sterilized. Modern, you'd autoclave it now, but it's like, what is going on? That is the, yeah. But I think that was the only way they could think of getting the thing into the ecosystem. Maybe, I don't know, but I just read that and thought that is some of the worst scientific practice in a book I've read for a long time, which is really weird because the science in this book is really good because
it's quite rigorous. And then it's just like, well, I couldn't figure out what this was, so I chucked it away.
Yeah, it's like, huh?
The thing that's been produced by the homicidal machine.
Yeah, I just sort of rinsed it down the plug hole. It's like, and then it goes into the firth, and that's it. It goes around the planet, but it is quite weird because the rest of the science is really good. It's really well thought out. So it's like you've got the nitrogen taking effect in the atmosphere. You've got the weather changes. There's a lot of talk about DNA, and I think Watson and Crick's mapped double helix. What was it, about mid-50s?
Yeah.
So there wasn't that much before this.
No,
so they're really sort of on top of the modern science that's going around.
Yeah, that's that is quite their sort of cutting edge bit for the DNA really does take the center stage for this book opposed to the last book, because the science story from the last book is that message from the stars. Now that's done and dusted. There is no more message. There's no more mystery about the machine, but there's a lot of stuff which gets involved with DNA. So obviously there's a fault with Andromeda or her DNA. There is the suspect sample which is chucked down the sink. That was that was part of it as well. And it goes on about the structure of the people from Andromeda's home planet as well, and how they had developed.
Yeah.
So I don't think it has anything absolutely significant to say about DNA. It's just sort of quite excited. Oh, look at this. We've sort of figured a lot of stuff out.
Yeah.
Using it in fiction.
I think a lot of what they're trying to say is, the consequences of science can be good, can be bad. It's almost like this post-war, post-nuclear bomb thing that, they've developed all this science. Was this good? Was this bad? And I don't know whether they deliberately wanted to say something about that, but that's what a lot of it sort of feels to me, reads that way. I think that's why you've got...
It's made quite explicit at the end of the book, where the wife of one of the scientists basically really does sort of tear Fleming off a strip.
Yeah.
And the president tears Duncan off a strip as well. But they're basically saying the same thing. It's like, oh, well, look, you say you've saved the world here, but you're the ones that got us in this position. And, when he's talking to Duncan, he's absolutely right. You're talking to exactly the right person.
Yeah,
I mean, Duncan does make amends. She realizes what she's done. She recognizes the issue and does her best to solve it, but not before presumably millions of deaths, which all conveniently happen off screen.
Yeah, and they don't really mention that. They don't really mention the human cost of what has been going on. Obviously, they sort of mention in passing, people can't breathe and it's going to be like the top of Everest at sea level and things like this, but it's all sort of in passing. There's no sort of obvious human cost to it, which...
No, it's done very sort of bureaucratically, and it's because these conversations are usually at this point happening in Downing Street. So, oh yes, well look, we've got problems here. We don't even have time to bury the bodies, and nobody can breathe. And he proceeds to light his pipe, and they do seem remarkably unconcerned about it in a very sort of late 50s British fashion. So that's
I'll go back to mention last time the Day of the Triffids. But if you read the Day of the Triffids, you know all the time about the human consequences of what happened when they're exploring London and all the people when they get caught up in the gangs in London. you know the human consequences of the whole of this and how it's changed. Whereas this book, it's more, as you said, bureaucratic. It's all about the organizations. It's all about the big pictures. But the problem is you need the little consequences to make the book more relatable.
And even when that is put to you, when it's in your face, it's so the mother of the scientist's wife is killed when the howling wind blows a house down. It's like, oh, your mother's dead. She's like, oh, well, okay, I'm not happy about your science. It's just really is that your reaction? It's it's pretty unemotional. And I don't think you don't have really any characters who are emotionally capable. Dornay, Fleming, too much of scientists. Fleming's capable of anger, and that's about it. You have the bureaucrats who just only see things in terms of figures. You have Andromeda, who doesn't have the emotional capacity and doesn't have the intellectual capacity for the first half of the book. She's a diminishing character. Possibly the only people you're seeing it from are the president and the scientist's family. No one else really has an emotional reaction to anything.
So I'll say one thing. In the last book, Judy Adamson was emotional in that book, which in some ways is why her being missing from this one makes quite a difference, because she was probably one of the only people who seemed to be emotional about the whole thing. And you've not got anybody in this book like that. And they could have expanded Andromeda a bit better, got her a bit more. Maybe not had her, because she's literally out of action, really, as you said, for the first half of the book, because she's obviously got injured and she's childlike from being disconnected from the computer. But later on, you could have added stuff.
I think it's a missed trick, because you do actually come to her at the beginning of this book where she is unshackled from the machine. That is the perfect opportunity to have her explore things emotionally. Although she probably won't have a great teacher in Fleming. She might be able to figure stuff out by herself. You had that guy on the island. I forget what his name was, but
the CND guy.
The CND, the heavily armed CND guy.
No, who happened to be living on the Western Isles.
Yeah, and living off tin food. He could have been, because he was a writer. So there you go. You got a writer. Have the writer take Andromeda under the wing. Only takes a couple of scenes, and I think it would have added, quite a bit more. I like the chapter names. Is quite a good clue early on.
What's going on? Yes, they're all
to do with the weather. In the first book, I was looking for it this time. In the first book, I didn't realize until about half a dozen chapters in, all the chapter names start with A. In this way, they're all weather or meteorological terms.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? So just have a quick look. I remember. Yes, because you start with outlook unsettled, cold front, gale warning, squall lines, sunny and warm, cyclone, storm center, forecast, depression, vortex, tornado, and clear sky. So they all tell you what's going on in each chapter, the feeling of each chapter.
Yeah, it's it's a nice touch. It doesn't take much effort to sort of give them that kind of.
It's quite nice.
There's some brilliant bits of writing. I wouldn't describe Fleming remotely as enigmatic and highly desirable, but Hoyle does in chapter 7. This is just before the truth drug trick is played on him. And basically, he has a drink which has the truth drug in it. Yes, I've got a feeling that this is a little bit of Fleming is a little bit of wish fulfillment on the part of Hoyle. I'm glad Hoyle wasn't entirely like Fleming. But it's around this sort of end of chapter 6, chapter 7 part of the book that the machine, now it's in touch with Andromeda again, starts to reassert itself. And I do quite like the fact that this iteration of the machine doesn't know what's going on with the weather, because it's the first machine that's come up with this idea of, killing off humanity all by itself. And there is no communication between, the first model and the second model. I was a little bit worried in chapter 8. You say, well, we've had a hurricane in the UK. We've never had a hurricane before. And I'm thinking, I'm sure we have. And I went and checked. And the first hurricane in the UK was 1987.
I remember that one.
That's the Michael Fish storm, isn't it?
That's the one that I went to work the following morning, not realizing this hurricane was there, on a motorbike at 45-degree angle. Because I used to live by the sea, and I was about 20-mile ride, and I got to work, and people said, "How did you get here?" Because there was people that lived like about 3 miles away that couldn't get in because of that. Just rode in as normal.
I mean, and the following day was Black Monday as well. Apart from anything else. So that was like a big sort of financial storm on top of the actual real storm. But I was quite surprised that there hadn't been a hurricane in the UK until that point. So at the time where they're writing this,
makes sense,
increased climate activity is a thing of the future, and we've never had a hurricane in the UK. And now it's like, well, we've had a few since then. And you may have seen from the news that something's up with the weather.
Yes, something's totally up. Yes.
Well, unless you're following this on Twitter, when everything's okay, but it's fairly prescient in. I mean, obviously the reasons are completely different, and everything happens a lot more quickly. But you are seeing a climate disaster here. So it's ahead of its time in that regard. This is before The Wind from Nowhere by Ballard and Ballard's other books. It's before
Hot House.
Yeah, it's before. I think it's before Hot House as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, which is one's about climate, and I think what other ones pop into my head. That's the ones that particularly pop into my head that sort of.
You've got like John Christopher, which I think came after as well.
All Flesh is Grass, yeah.
So, On the Quiet, and we saw it in the first book, On the Quiet, Hoyle seems to be quite ahead of his time scientifically, which makes sense, him being a scientist, to sort of show this in the writing. He was ahead of the game in talking about climate fiction. Not man-made, right? This is machine-made, but the machine is man-made. So it's a man-made disaster in the fact that Dornay pulled it down the sink, but it's a little bit of disaster is sprinkled into the story, but unfortunately, because of the constraints of the TV program, this is done mostly by way of exposition. Well, I'm explaining to you that lots of these things have happened elsewhere. Now, in the TV series, you see some stock footage of really high winds and stuff like that to give you the feel of it. But if you are just reading the book, you don't see them battling the elements really at any point, other than, I'm struggling to breathe a little bit. But then you get the obligatory scene. Prime Minister comes in chapter 10. The Prime Minister is always there in a Fred Hoyle book, it seems. And it's only really at this point that the penny drops for them that Intel is the real baddie, even though they've been told this for at least a book's length by Fleming. And then so the action really sort of picks up. It's it has to be quite a quick ending, I suppose.
It wraps up rather neatly, doesn't it? It's because you get the bit when Andromeda links back to the computer, and then she says, "I know what the message is," and the message is basically that they want to stop humanity destroying itself by controlling humanity, which is a sort of theme that's gone through so many science fiction books and films that you've seen it before. But then saying that, it's probably one of the earliest iterations in sort of modern sort of golden age science fiction of that idea. It's a bit, because it's gone through books, everything from Arthur C. Clarke to Star Trek did it about 25 times.
But certainly in the way it's been done remotely as well.
Yeah.
It's like you've actually sort of, this isn't an invasion because we can't send the aliens from A to B because of, Hoyle is sticking to the limitations of space travel. So, but we can get this message sent and do it this way, which is, that's still the I think the great innovation of this series. But yeah, it does wrap up quite quickly, considering they fix the environment in what seems like a weekend's worth of like real concentrated effort to come up with a new solution. I do like the fact that they used a machine to do so, and that Andromeda is the one that has to choose between spending her time to do that or spend some time looking at a cure for her own ailment.
Yeah,
there was something missing in her genetic makeup when she was created, and this has to be put back in place because I think it's her nervous system's collapsing, something like that, isn't it? But yeah, it does wrap up very quickly. Now, the TV series, what did you make of it?
It didn't grip me, but and I don't think that's because it's age, because I've watched lots of stuff from that sort of period and done well. The drama of that period is really, really good. I've got lined up to watch actually a program called Gazette, which was apparently very good one about newspaper. I managed there, but yeah, this one is. I think it's because all the people talking in rooms and the way they were talking. And I think that's why, to me, it didn't grip me as much. And when you see things like Quatermass, Andrew Neil's Quatermass before there, and he didn't have huge amounts of location shooting either, but he managed to do something well within it. He had the ideas, and even the speech and stuff worked really well. I think they just needed some better directors. Maybe a better director on it.
Yeah.
And I can't judge the first series because all we've got is one bit episode, and I had a brief look at that, and it's very hard to tell because you've not seen the rest of it, to put it in context. But in some ways, I think that could be why. I think the books have survived sort of without the series, because I said they've been reprinted numerous times and they've carried their way through. I think they survived because of the ideas within them. There's some really, really good ideas in there, not because of the TV series, even though people think it is, and not because of how well they're written. It's more of the ideas and when the ideas were done.
Yeah, I think the direction.
I know they had fixed cameras and stuff like this. They couldn't.
Well, there's limitations from that perspective.
Yeah.
But it seems to be as soon as anyone comes into contact with the machine, so Madame Gamble and obviously Andromeda, it's like, I will talk like this.
Yeah.
Doesn't make for the most interesting videos. As you know, Susan Hampshire can act. Don't make her.
She's very good.
Don't make her talk like she's a machine. The whole idea is she's not a machine.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of defeated the object of making a human if she's going to talk like a machine.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, I read the book before I saw the TV show.
Yeah, I did. So.
And I'm going, okay, so we're in the Middle East. Oh, God. Please cast appropriately.
No, they didn't. No, there's an Irishman in there.
Yes, that was. I mean, Salim, isn't he?
Yeah, played by an Irishman.
Well, yeah, that was a very strange Middle Eastern thing. The president is Arnold Yarrow, who only died last month at the age of 103.
Wow.
He was like he was the oldest surviving at the time Doctor Who cast member. He's in I think he's in Maldron Undead. But yes, he wasn't too bad as a president. He had some good speeches, and I think he was appropriately dotty when he needed to be. And then I think he's the ideal, this is like a public intellectual who's been elevated to political supremacy rather than someone who's achieved it militarily. I think Mary Morris is good. She flubs her lines a few times, but I think Fleming is good as an actor. It's just what he's being asked to portray. I quite like Osborne. I think he does bring that character to life. Have you seen Withnail I?
Not for many years, but I have seen it. Yes.
He played the pub landlord, where he gets progressively more drunk. This is like the pub landlord up north. This is the old colonel who gives him free drinks when Withnail pretends that they were ex-army. So he's the old guy when Boone comes in and slams the eels on the bar. So yeah, he's the pub landlord. I was looking at him going, I know him, and that can be the only thing I know him from. But I was watching it going, he looks really familiar. I thought at the beginning he looked like a young Robert Hardy. Sort of what's his face from All Creatures Great and Small.
Yeah.
But I thought it might have been him, but it turns out it was this other actor. I don't think anyone does too badly. I think the casting is off, but unfortunately that's what they used to do. It's okay, well, we'll just give you a darker shade of makeup and you can play someone who's Middle Eastern. And it's just like, it's a bit cringeworthy. But they do what they can with it. The machine still is the same. I do like the noises the machine makes. It's like it seems a little bit low tech for how high tech it's supposed to be. Like beyond any technology you can comprehend, and it's all like whirring away in the background.
And the thing is about that is all they needed to do is watch a few science fiction films around that time. There's some really good ones with computers in that will give you some ideas to make something a little more futuristic.
Yeah, but I think what they're doing here is like looking to see what they've got left in the props cupboard that they can make it.
BBC,
I don't know. Yeah. I can't remember because I didn't watch the last episode of the first Andromeda series. I don't know if they actually destroy the machine, whether they've had to rebuild it. But I suppose as well, if they're building it to the same spec, they've got to try and make it look exactly the same. So you're limited by what you did on the first one. You can't make the second one bigger and better because it's supposed to be exactly the same. I don't know. I feel like we've been too down on this in this discussion. I enjoyed it better than the first book.
See, my thing about it is I would say that they are both worth reading, and I would probably reread them at some point. It will be quite a while, but I will probably reread them at some point because it's always quite nice to get a slightly different perspective on them at some point. And I think if you're interested in science fiction, and especially science fiction in that era, they are worth reading. They are worth reading just because of the ideas they're putting forward in 1962 and 1964, and some of the science ideas, and I think that is why they have survived. as novelizations, and they've been sort of taken away from the novelization of things that people quote them, and I've seen people quote them and not realizing they come from the TV series. But they suffer from not having a better writers putting them together. If you'd had somebody who wrote novelizations, and was used to working within those bounds and filling in scenes around it as good writers can, it would have made it such a better book and could have made it really, really good books.
Yeah, I think this suffers the same issue. They didn't learn the lesson from the first one. It's just like, you are not shackled by what happened on the screen.
Yeah.
No one's going to complain that you put an extra scene or a car chase or whatever it is in here that is there something that you wanted to do but couldn't in the TV series? Stick it in. And I just think they go, do you know what? No, we're just going to look at the shooting script and we're going to put a little bit of description in between these bits, and basically that is our structure, which is workmanlike. But yeah, they could have done something a bit better. But then you are looking at a scientist who is becoming an author and a screenwriter who never did, who actually ended up becoming like a producer and a director. So none of them are full-time authors. Having said that, I mean, it's still, there's a lot going for it in this one that isn't in the first one. You have the extra, the espionage, you have the exotic locales. It's a bit more jet setty.
Yeah, when it turned into a thriller was when I really got in with it.
Yeah.
And that's when it got interesting. When I think it's probably after they hit the island, hit the Western Isles, and then you start hearing about the all the espionage bits. That's when I started to get into it a bit more. But before that, it was very plodding, very dull. And I think, as I said in a community post I put up, that's why I do not DNF books, because I hear of people DNFing them after like sort of 2 or 3 pages or 20 pages. Well, you would have done it on this, or because you would have thought, is this worth my time? But it develops into something that is worth your time, and I really think it is worth your time. And I don't want to sound like I'm too down on this book, but critically, if you're taking it apart, there's lots of issues with it, but it's still worth reading.
Yeah, there's a lot here to like, and if you don't like the espionage bit, hang around for sort of 2/3 of the way through, where it becomes a climate disaster book.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a roller coaster. It is sort of genre speaking.
Yeah, because I think another thing it suffers from is there's too many plot points going on.
Yeah,
and so there's at some point you think, so which plot point are we going to go for this time? And I think that's where the characters suffered, because they were trying to jam all this stuff into here. I think because they were trying to outdo the first series, so they wanted to put so much more into it.
You could realistically have ditched all of the Azeran stuff.
Yeah.
And then it's just have, this is what's happened at the end of the last book. There's something up with the weather. And you could have made a whole story on that.
Yeah.
And, it probably wouldn't have been as interesting. It would have been a little more cohesive. It would have been shorter. Yeah. But then you wouldn't have needed to wrap it up so quickly either. So, I mean, this is a bit where it's just, I don't think the change of heart from Kaufman is unbelievable. I think the speed at which it happens makes it a bit more so, for example. It is just like, you've Dusseldorf is destroyed, is it? Well, right now I'm angry. It's happened.
What would have been good is if they'd actually extended the climate thing over a few years.
Yeah.
Extended the plot out, and it would have been quite easy to fill it up with people being a passage of time. Would have been quite easy to put into the book without really affecting the pace of the book or anything like that, and that would have made some more believable some of the changes. And also, as you said, the fact that they found a cure to it in a weekend, basically.
Yeah. Well, it would also have made it a lot more believable, all of the I mean, as well as being one of the first sort of climate disaster things, there's a lot in here of climate change denial. This must be the first ever example of climate change denial. People say, well, that's got nothing to do with anything. It's like, well, no, have you not seen what it's like? I mean, all right, that's a little bit of the usual mistake of mistaking the weather for the climate. But it's obvious that something is up, and people are probably promptly sticking their heads in the sand and saying, well, it can't be anything to do with that. Or not seeing that their own future is imperiled by the same thing. Just like, well, you're finding it harder to breathe the same as everybody else is. I am going to continue to read Fred Hoyle.
Yeah, I'm interested to read some of his stuff, actually. Some of his the stuff where he's a little more freedom, a little more, he's not constrained by the TV of what's gone before.
I'd say The Black Cloud and October the 1st is too late. Black Cloud is his first, and October the 1st is too late is him. Actually, I mean, and both of those are ones that he did on his own. So some he wrote with his son later on in his career. These ones he wrote with Eliot. Those two books, one at the beginning, one at the midpoint of his career, both ones he did just under his own name, and I think they're the best two that I've read. The Black Cloud is very much of its time. That is very much Tweed and Pipes kind of science, but it's good fun. But yeah, that's it's been an experience, and I probably wouldn't have watched the series had I not been doing it. So I'm glad I've seen that as well.
Yeah.
I knew that the first one was destroyed. I hadn't really thought about the second series.
But as I said, it's looked back, and I think people looking back at the first series and thinking it's better than it probably is.
Yeah, there are limitations, but
yeah, because just looking at the second series, you're thinking, well, if the first one was like this, and I said to quote, when you had things like I said beforehand, Quatermass and stuff around at the same time, that was production-wise managed to do stuff better. I'm sorry it did than that. People quote that as a classic, but I think because it got destroyed, people think it's better than it was. I could be wrong. It could be somebody one day might find some tapes of it and I might watch it and think, wow. But the books, I said, I think have survived because the ideas are quite ahead of their time, a lot of them. And the fact they used the science of the time, they used DNA, and as you said, the climate science, climate science appeared before that, but it's one of the first appearances of climate science really in a book like that.
Yeah, like I say, I agree. It is, cutting edge, but cutting edge early 1960s. So, it's difficult reading it 60 years on, trying to put yourself in that position. But it's you've got to sort of take your hat off to the science side of it. And there weren't I can't think of many other scientists who were writing speculative.
The nearest to it would have been R.C. Clarke.
Yeah, but I think he was first and foremost always a writer, rather than a scientist. Yeah, I mean, you could say the same about Asimov. Asimov was a scientist as well, but you don't. He's a writer first.
But he didn't really. I think with Clarke, I think he wrote more sciencey type stuff. Really, didn't he, than Asimov fiction in his fiction. Though you can argue either way, I suppose. But yeah, I always forget that Asimov was a scientist, even though I've got a bunch of his non-fiction stuff there. I've got a bunch of his science books, but for some reason I forget that he was foremost, degree. He had ridiculous amounts of degrees in that. But Clarke, I always think of as a scientist.
Yeah. I don't know how much of that is a little bit of puffery.
Yeah, it could be totally because
it's always about, oh yeah, he invented the satellite. Well, he had the idea.
He put the theories around there, and then other people invented it. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm a big fan of Clark, but you can't believe sort of everything you hear.
Yeah, Clark's one of these authors I struggle with. Clark, I always have. I think I should love him, and every time I read one of his books, I don't love it. But
which ones have you read then?
So there would have been a little edit there because we went off on a tangent that really can't be included in this because it was too much of a tangent. But have you got anything else you wish to say about these books?
I don't think so. Other than the fact that don't be put off by the amount we've dissected it. I think we might end up doing this with any book we approach.
Yeah,
it's just there is a lot to like in this, but it's probably more from the ideas rather than the structure side of things.
Yeah, there is definitely a lot to like in them there. And I said I would do this to books that I know I adore, and I'd not rip them apart, but I'd try and find the issues with them, because even in the best thing, there's always things you think, oh, could that be different? Could that be? And it's always worth discussing. But these they're very readable. Even though I said I did get a bit bored at one point, but they are still very readable books, and they do follow a lot of the science at the time. And there's a reason why they keep getting reprinted, and they are in the SF Masterworks series now as both books together. I think they are, aren't they?
Yeah.
And there is a reason they're there, and it is because they are, can you call them classics of the genre? They are very important books within.
They're part of the pantheon.
Yes, and they're very important books within the whole history of science fiction, I think, especially British science fiction.
Yes, I think of it at that time is probably quite influential on a little bit of the sort of the dourness of later 60s and early 70s science fiction. I think it was quite ahead of its time in, it's just cold and calculating, and he certainly moved away from the whole sort of space opera adventure side of things.
Yeah. Sorry if you've heard my little coffee little Yorkie at the back, for anybody's watching, and I think we will say bye for now, but we will be back at some point.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah.